will be coming in, but we are very fortunate to have with us tonight Professor Walter Glannon from the University of Calgary, from the Department of Philosophy. Professor Glannon has just published a new book on psychiatric neuroethics. He has a previous book called Brain, Body, Mind, Neuroethics of the Human Face, among other books and articles. I think you'll find the topic tonight very interesting. Feel free to ask questions, and I'm sure Dr. Glannon will be happy to answer them. Walter?
Thank you. First, I want to thank Dr. Winsley for inviting me and the Moody Foundation for making this possible. This is a great lecture series, and I'm honored to be part of it. So my talk is on cognitive enhancement. You're probably, I assume most of you are not familiar with the bioethics literature. Bioethics just basically is a branch or a subcategory of applied ethics in philosophy or other areas of the humanities. It's probably, I would say it's the most hotly debated area of bioethics. There were times when genetics still is very much so, and prenatal, preconceptual issues, but cognitive enhancement has become a very, very hot topic. Largely because, like the other issues I just mentioned, there's a considerable disagreement about what it is in the first place, how do you define it, and whether it's something that should be permitted or not. So the term enhancement itself has different definitions, and I'm going to go through some of them today. Okay, so the Oxford English Dictionary defines enhance as to heighten, intensify, or improve. Eric Jung's, this is an important book published in the late 90s. It's about a human enhancement. And his definition was to improve human form or functioning beyond what is necessary to sustain or restore good health. This was in the context of a distinction which I'm going to mention later on. I'll show a slide toward the end of the talk about whether there is or should be a distinction between therapy and enhancement. So you have a disease, or you fracture a leg, fracture an arm, you go to the doctor, they give you something, you have a medical condition, a disease, some sort of physical ailment, something is given to you to treat it, you recover. Enhancement, at least originally the idea was that you have normal physical and mental functioning, but you're taking something to make it even better. And that's where the ethical controversy arises. So what I want to do is go through, first of all, 3 different scenarios. So one is you have a student who takes Ritalin. Ritalin is a drug which is prescribed for people who have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or some other disorders as well. But in this case, this is a student who doesn't have ADHD, has no cognitive impairment, no problems at all, but takes it in order to become more focused, to concentrate better, and to do better on exams. So it's to give himself a competitive edge over the other students. So he takes it, turns out that he does improve his performance. He does better than the other students. Other students don't take the drug. So the one question is it unfair to the other students? Is the student cheating by doing this, by relying on something other than his own effort to achieve his goal? So he's taking a substance to help him think better, but is that a form of cheating? For example, in sports, the doping scandals. It's a question people are morally outraged by it because these athletes are taking something to help them, something beyond their own capacities, their own abilities. And there's something wrong about that. That's cheating. So is that the same here? Would we say the same thing here? Is he not being authentic? Just in the sense is he doing something, by taking a drug, is he doing something that's against who he is? Something that goes against his identity and his own capacities, natural capacities to put effort into what he does and to achieve things, to reach his goals without any sort of aids like Ritalin. Can he take credit for what he does? So when people achieve things, we praise them, or if they do something wrong, we blame them. We give them credit on the assumption that they do it through their own efforts, through their own exercise of their own natural capacities, not with the aid of a drug like Ritalin. So does that change it? Does it change the way we think about taking credit for what we do? Or is it because of the drug? Is the drug doing all the work? It becomes complicated because the drug may be doing some of the work. How much of it is really up to him? Okay. Second scenario. So airline pilots on long flights, transcontinental, intercontinental flights. Suppose you're flying from here to Buenos Aires or to New Zealand, Australia, very, very long flight. And a pilot takes Provigil, the technical name was modafinil. It's actually a drug prescribed for sleep-wake disorders. So this is what's called an off-label use, something it's not ordinarily prescribed for, but it does affect sleep-wake cycles. It enables people to stay awake longer than normal. So they take, it's partly hypothetical. There is anecdotal evidence that this has happened. There have been studies on this as well. So they take it, they stay awake for the duration of the flight, and I've been reading reports of pilots who doze off during flights, and that's very disturbing because I, like a lot of you, fly a lot, and I want the pilot of my United flight or Delta flight to be awake and not be dozing off at the controls. So the question is, one question is, isn't it better that they take the drug to stay awake than to risk dozing off? Provided that the effect doesn't wear off before we land, of course. So the reaction that I think a lot of people would have, not everyone, is that there's something, I think, more disturbing about the first case of the student who takes Ritalin to do better in school, that there is some sense of cheating. Whereas, at least I personally, this bothers me, but it doesn't bother me as much or in the same way as the first case. Because how it affects me, for some reason I think that I'm better off as a passenger in a plane, but maybe I'm not. Here's another one. Surgeons at a hospital, they're performing longer hours, they're performing more surgeries. The sleep issue, it's not just sleep, but concentration, focus. When someone's doing surgery, of course, you want them to be focused, you want them to be alert, awake. Some take the same drug, Provigil or Adderall, which is a stimulant, and to stay awake, to do more surgeries, okay, for longer hours, longer periods. So suppose I'm going to be scheduled for surgery late in the day. And of course, I prefer that my surgeon is alert and not sleepy when it's my turn. And so again, as long as the effect of the drug doesn't wear off while I'm undergoing surgery, I'm wondering whether it would bother me knowing that that surgeon is taking this drug to stay awake. So another one, similar, another surgical example. I'm scheduled for neurosurgery. I have an aneurysm. So I've been having headaches, and I undergo a scan, CT scan, MRI, showing that I've got an aneurysm. And it could burst, I could bleed to death. If the surgery isn't done properly, I could bleed to death too. So it's crucial that the surgeon remain calm throughout the procedure. But before the procedure, I'm told by the nurse that the neurosurgeon takes Inderol. This is the beta blocker drug. It dampens the cardiovascular, the response of the autonomic nervous system, and keeps people calm. So there's not much of you don't have that fear response. It's not triggered if something unexpected happens. So he does this, or she does this, to remain calm during surgery. Knowing this makes me feel less anxious and more reassured going into the surgery. So this is a sort of an indirect form of cognitive enhancement. That is, the drug doesn't directly increase the ability to focus, to concentrate, to make decisions, to process information, to make more effective, efficient decisions, but rather it has a biological effect which enables people to stay calm and not allow other things to interfere with cognitive processes involving such things as surgery. This is not hypothetical. The airline example is not really hypothetical. This I know at my institution, well, it's anecdotal. There haven't been actual reports of any particular neurosurgeon doing it, but anecdotally, I have heard reports of people neurosurgeons who take this drug to remain calm. Surgery, okay. Now, so intuitively, that to me doesn't seem to be wrong. Intuitively, what the example of the airline pilots taking modafinil or Provigil to stay awake doesn't strike me as being wrong. The case of the student taking Ritalin to do better on exams does seem to be wrong, because there's some sense, to me, it strikes me as a form of cheating. So am I wrong? So I think a lot of people would have the same intuitions. And the question is, why do we have those? I don't know, maybe this can come up in the question period. Maybe some of you think that all three cases are bad and it shouldn't be permitted in any of them. So generally negative attitude, I think, response toward the student, and the positive one toward the pilots and the surgeons. Why? Why is that? Each person in each situation is taking a drug. They're taking something, they're doing something other than using their own natural capacities to perform a function. So they're enhancing their performance, enhancing their functions to do better. But why is it that in the first case, there does seem to be something wrong, and the other two not, at least not so much? There are social norms and expectations about what we do to ourselves, and those are going to be affected in turn by how what we do to ourselves affect other people. And so the pilot, the surgeon, what they do seems, of course you have to take long-term risks and the possibility of things going wrong into account as well. But from the way I describe the examples, they seem to have, if not a positive effect, at least not a negative, harmful effect on others. Whereas the student, by taking the drug, when other students don't, and having that competitive edge, he is doing something which some people would say is harming the others, or at least there's something unfair, it's an unfair advantage. At least that's the intuition. Now, as I said, in the question period, we can discuss that. Maybe some of you disagree. Okay, so Ritalin, Adderall, and other stimulant drugs, they enhance cognitive functions having to do with working memory. This is one type of memory system which involves processing information for very short periods. So it has to do with executive functions. So you're getting all this information, you have to make a decision in a short period of time. So it's these sort of short-term decision-making. There are other drugs. Namenda is it's also called memantine, which I'm not sure is still used. It was used in clinical trials for early stage Alzheimer's patients. The results were not very good. But that's another, this has been used by people as an enhancer. And neurostimulating techniques, deep brain stimulation, transcranial magnetic stimulation, they can enhance spatial and working memory. There have been a number of studies using deep brain stimulation where people with early stage Alzheimer's, they did have some improvement in memory, spatial and working memory. Okay, deep brain stimulation, if those of you who are not familiar with it, this is a very invasive type of psychosurgery or psychiatric neurosurgery where electrodes are implanted in a particular region of the brain associated with Parkinson's disease, or Alzheimer's, for example, would be memory centers in the brain. And the electrodes are connected by wires or leads to a implanted pulse generator, usually under the collarbone. And the patient has a handheld device. They can control the stimulator of the amount of current that goes to the electrodes. It has been effective. The problem is it's very invasive, it's very expensive, and there is the issue of control. If the patient is not in a controlled clinical setting, there's a risk that they may overstimulate their brain. I'm going to give an example of that. Or do something else that could have harmful effects. Transcranial magnetic stimulation is not as cumbersome. It's not invasive. There's a thing that you put on your head, and the electrical current is transmitted into the brain. The problem is the effects are usually transient of TMS, and the current can't penetrate very deeply into the brain. So the regions of the brain that are usually associated with memory, like the hippocampus, may not be reached by TMS. But still, the main thing is it's mostly drugs that are used for enhancement. So they improve attention, concentration, and they can result in more efficient, effective problem solving. The neurotransmitter they work on is dopamine. That's, in most cases, that's the main neurotransmitter. Okay, so I was talking earlier about the different conceptions or definitions of enhancement. Okay, the conception that I think a lot of people have when they hear enhancement is the first conception that was described and defended in the bioethics literature, and that is augmenting. So it's increasing the level of capacity in doing, what the brain or the mind does. So normal levels, no problem with processing information, problem solving. It's just that you're trying to improve it, make it more efficient, more effective, faster decision making. Diminishing is a bit misleading because it's the idea is that you take something like Ritalin if you have ADHD to narrow your focus, so it's to limit the scope of the information you're dealing with, to limit the scope of your attention, of the field that you're dealing with. That to me is effectively the same as optimizing, which is that enhancement is any intervention that aims at optimizing a specific class of information processing functions, specifically cognitive functions. This is something which Thomas Metzinger, who was a philosopher from Germany, and Elizabeth Hilt came up with. That to me is, I think, that's the conception of enhancement that most people working in writing and or involved in the enhancement debate use. That is, it's above normal, but it's slightly above normal, so it's just not augmenting indefinitely, that there are limits, so it does recognize this idea of limit. I'm going to give some examples. Okay. The cognitive enhancement is quite extensive. Now, these figures, may seem dated, the dates, but the data pretty much is unchanged. The percentage of people who engage in different types of enhancement is pretty much the same. I'm not really sure about age differences, for example, whether more adolescents or elderly are taking enhancement drugs. Not really clear. But in 2008, there was one study, so approximately 25% of American high school students use psychostimulants. 7% of university students use them for non-therapeutic use. Now, this is U.S. This is based on U.S. data, okay, not globally. 33% of Nature readers. Nature is a British science magazine, so these are mainly people from the UK. Of Nature readers. Now, these are many of these are scientists. These are researchers. Said they had used psychostimulants for off-label, non-therapeutic reasons. Okay, off-label, again, so modafinil provigil is a drug for people with sleep-wake disorders. But off-label just means that it's being prescribed and used for something other than what it was designed for, or intended for. There are a lot of drugs and medicine that have off-label uses not for enhancement purposes. For example, there's an anti-seizure medication, gabapentin or Neurontin, which a lot of people take for pain. It's also used in some cases of depression and has been effective. So off-label doesn't mean it's just being used for enhancement, although all enhancement drugs involve off-label uses. So it's pretty extensive, and here's one that'll really hit you. Franke is a German psychiatrist, and he did a study on chess, which the young folks in the audience will be interested in seeing. I've got a slide coming up. In Germany, 89% of patients prescribed modafinil did not have a psychiatric or neurological diagnosis. Now, this raises such a high percentage. Some of you may be thinking, well, who's prescribing this? And it raises the question, among other things, one of the questions it raises is, do physicians have an obligation to prescribe, or are they permitted to prescribe these drugs for conditions that are not medical conditions, where people don't have some sort of physical or mental impairment? Are they permitted to prescribe them for different reasons? Okay. It's complicated because it's not, you can't just say, well, there's no disease, there's no condition, physical or mental, therefore they shouldn't be prescribing it. It's more complicated than that. Although intuitively, when you first, if someone raises the question, a lot of us, I think, would be inclined to say, well, it's just wrong. So something's going on here, especially with such a high percentage. Also based on studies, this one is, again, dated from 2004, but it was a very good study by Martha Farah, who was a neuroscientist, and about 10 other people. And the data have been pretty consistent over the years. People with a lower cognitive baseline tend to do better when they take these drugs. And those with a higher cognitive baseline tend to not to do so much. They benefit less. But even the positive effects are usually mild to moderate. So it's not the sort of thing that just jumps out at you. So the first example of the student who takes Ritalin to do better, in most cases when that happens, the improvement, there is improvement, but it's in many cases is not significant. And those who don't have a disorder like ADHD, and there are many cases in the studies indicating that they don't benefit at all. So this is general. But many people do benefit. It's just not a substantial or significant benefit. Yeah, okay. So this raises some interesting questions. If the worse off cognitively, naturally, do better with these drugs, then the better off, would that somehow level the playing field? Would that actually make things more fair than they are in society? Some people are just not cognitively as well off. They don't function as well mentally in school or in work than others. Is this a way of leveling the playing field, bringing them up to the level of people who are smarter through no fault of their own? They just happen to be smart. Not to leave out effort, but I'm just saying just natural baseline. Okay, so some examples, airline pilots, surgeons, accountants, so they're better at number crunching. Students, better performance on exams. Teachers, they won't have to rely on notes, like when I'm teaching. Like right now, I don't have to look back at the screen. Or if I'm doing a course on Aristotle, and I'm saying, what did he say in that passage? Maybe it would help me. I'd be a better teacher. The other thing I didn't mention here is, I don't know if any of you are researchers, grant applications. A lot of researchers, people working in labs, they rely heavily on grants, on grant money to run their labs and hire research assistants and postdocs and everything else. So that takes time. And I do know a lot of people some who have taken enhancers for that reason. So researchers or others. Other activities involving working memory, short-term information processing. Okay, all of this. So it is widespread. And so again, the important points here, it's widespread. It is effective, it does work to some extent. So it does improve cognitive functions in some cases, but taking into account what one's natural cognitive baseline is. Okay, chess, here you go. This is a study that Professor Franke from Germany ran. So he wanted to, actually I met him about 5 years ago, and the problem with cognitive enhancement was, how can you do research, can you do a clinical trial showing that it really is effective? Because a lot of it has been anecdotal. So he did a placebo-controlled trial. So there was one group that took a certain drug or drugs, and another group didn't. Well, they took a placebo pill. They didn't know what they were getting, so that's how you test for the placebo effect, to see if the drug is really doing what it's supposed to do. So there were 39 male chess players. The fact that they're all male is a limitation in itself, but they played 20 15-minute games, and the results were modifying effects of stimulants on complex cognitive tasks may in particular result from more reflective decision-making processes. When under time pressure, such effects may result in enhanced performance. Yet, under time constraints, more reflective decision-making may not improve or even have a detrimental effects on complex task performance. Okay, so it's a controlled study. There's certain conditions that obtain. The thing about enhancement is, I said they work, but under certain conditions, and there can be trade-offs, as he's alluding to here. And I'm going to show a few more slides about this, that in many cases, in a lot of the studies done on enhancement, some functions improve, but others actually are impaired. So they get better at some things, some tasks, cognitive tasks, but worse at others. And this is where this optimizing idea comes in. Okay, so depending on time constraints, cognition-enhancing drugs may improve some functions and impair others. So drugs that improve fast thinking may impair slow thinking, or vice versa. So whether they enhance information processing is really going to depend on which functions are affected and how long the effect is. So I mentioned the airline pilots and the surgeons. So that's an extended period. The chess study is for a very short-term period. So that's an issue as well. Okay, this article by Line, he discusses the chess study, but he contextualizes, he puts it in a broader context, and among other things, he does talk about trade-offs and a lot of these uses of cognitive enhancing drugs. What's not known, what I haven't seen any studies testing the trade-offs in the cases of the airline pilots who take Provigil, or the surgeons who take Inderal or propranolol. It's not really clear. Okay, so here's an example of trade-off. So this is transcranial magnetic stimulation. I mentioned this earlier. So this is not a drug, it's electrical stimulation of the brain. One study done by these two people in 2013, Glannon and Cohen Kadosh, what they did was they stimulated different regions of the brain. By stimulating one region, they found that it enhanced the ability to learn mathematical knowledge or information, but it impaired their ability to apply what they had learned. And then by stimulating a different region of the brain, it had the opposite effect. So it enhanced their ability to apply information they already had, but it impaired their ability to learn new information. So, I mean, we have to be careful not to generalize, but it does, these are examples of how there can be trade-offs with cognitive enhancement. Okay, memory is a big area of research with enhancement. And this is where, I know some of you are interested in this distinction between therapy and enhancement, and whether you can really draw a line between the two. I find that a lot of neurologists and neurosurgeons who are doing experiments with memory, they use the word enhancement. What they're really talking about is improvement. So these are people who do have some cognitive impairment. They do have some memory loss, like early stage Alzheimer's, early stage dementia. And there's improvement in their memory functions. Whether it's enhancement or not, I mean, these things fall along a spectrum. I'll say something about that in a few minutes. So, but the drugs have not been very effective. Like I mentioned Namenda earlier, but deep brain stimulation has been effective in some patients with early stage Alzheimer's. So it increases activity in memory-related brain regions like the hippocampus, fornix, entorhinal cortex. These are all involved in memory formation and memory retrieval. And it's important because that time, that period when people are developing a neurodegenerative disease, to have improvement in their cognitive function, it can improve their quality of life and functional independence, or at least sustain it for a longer period. It's not, there have been a few studies, not all of these have been positive, and the patients in these studies, not all of them benefit. So that's another thing you have to be careful about. Not only are there trade-offs, or not only do you have to think about impairment as well as benefit, but also the fact that not everybody who takes these benefits at all. That it may be a neutral effect, it may not be positive or negative. Yeah, so memory is big. Not too long ago, ginkgo biloba, did you hear about this supplement? It was pretty popular. It was supposed to enhance memory. It was an over-the-counter thing. And my wife bought some, and I said, "What is this?" She said, "It's ginkgo biloba. It's supposed to improve your memory." So I said, "Okay." So about a week later, I looked at it and I said, "What did you say this was for?" She said, "Obviously it doesn't work." Anyway, but anyway, deep brain stimulation, it has effective. It's the thing is, it's very invasive, it's cumbersome, it's expensive. So there's some question about just how viable it would be. Even if studies showed that deep brain stimulation actually could delay the progression of Alzheimer's. This gets into social healthcare issues about whether healthcare systems could afford to have many people, I mean, given the increasing incidence of dementia, undergo deep brain stimulation. It's a big issue. But, you know, this is still in the experimental investigational phase. Actually, this was just, I just saw this yesterday. This is Benedict Carey in the New York Times. It was just yesterday. He said, brain implants, devices that enhance normal but less than optimal cognitive function. Okay, so I was addressing this distinction between optimal versus normal, and enhancement as something that is really optimal. It's not just augmenting something in an unlimited way. Electrical stimulation of the medial temporal lobe, patient that's epilepsy, improved memory. That's significant because a lot of epilepsy patients do have memory impairment. Okay. So there are limits. Studies and cases showing limits of cognitive enhancement support the optimizing conception. Okay, so the three were augmenting, limiting, and optimizing. Optimizing seems to make the most sense. Raising neurotransmitters or other brain functions beyond an optimal level can result in more problems than benefits. Okay, DBS and euphoria. Okay, this is an actual case I'm going to talk about right now. It's not hypothetical. There was a patient in Switzerland. No, actually Germany. The psychiatrist is Swiss, but he's working in Germany. Had severe depression and anxiety disorder for years. Drugs weren't effective, so he underwent deep brain stimulation. Deep brain stimulation is experimental, okay? It hasn't been FDA approved. Well, it has for Parkinson's and movement disorders. And except for some cases of obsessive compulsive disorder, it has not been approved for as a standard treatment for depression or anxiety. So this is in Germany. So he underwent deep brain stimulation, and his symptoms were relieved. His mood improved, his motivation improved. And he went to the psychiatrist and he said, you know, I feel good. I'd like to feel even better. Could you increase the frequency of the electrical current? And surprisingly, well, I think it's surprising, the psychiatrist said, okay, let's try it. Okay. Oh, okay, I should say this is in a controlled setting, okay? So the frequency, the electrical current was increased. And it's interesting, the patient, he became euphoric, but he retained enough awareness and insight to say to the psychiatrist, I feel unrealistically good. And I feel that I'm going to tilt over. So maybe we should put it back down again. So it's interesting. So he caught himself before he actually got to a manic phase where he just would have lost control. So I think this case illustrates how there are limits to how far you can go. Even if some form of enhancement works, there are limits. So, for example, I mentioned dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that's involved in cognitive enhancement. Well, if you raise levels of dopamine to a high enough level, you're going to affect the reward system in the brain, which could lead to addictive behavior. Okay, so it's a form of losing control. So there are limits. There are limits to this. So, and what's difficult, because enhancement is not something that's regulated, and all of the studies are still experimental, it's really, no one really knows, where to draw the line. How much extra, a dose of, what dosage of Provigil or what dosage of Ritalin for someone who doesn't have a psychiatric or neurological disorder is going to be safe enough to actually increase their level of function, but not to the point where it leads to some sort of psychopathology and harms them rather than benefits them. Okay, so there are limits to memory too. These are Borges, the Argentine writer, just a great fictional story about this guy who falls off a horse, and rather than develop amnesia, he remembers everything. But he can't conceptualize, he can't think about things that may happen in the future. His mind, his brain become overloaded with information. The famous Russian neuropsychologist Luria had a patient who also just remembered everything but wasn't able to hold a job. And then there's a very interesting book by Jill Price, The Woman Who Can't Forget. This is a woman who has what's called hyperthymestic syndrome. So it's the exact opposite. It's the other extreme of amnesia. This is someone who has incredible autobiographical memory. But the woman who's affected said that it's a burden, it's really a curse to have this because it just affects her life so badly. So again, the idea of limits, illustrated in these real life cases. So there's no clear evidence so far of short-term risks. The long-term risks are not known. This is something that's going to have to be determined with more studies, longitudinal studies. As I said, okay, gambling, hypersexuality. I highlighted this because I know that there would be students in the audience. It's very unwise for anyone to consider, especially if there are physicians prescribing it. I'm not saying that they do this, but for adolescents to be engaging in these practices. And as you know, one of the earlier slides indicated, there are a lot of high school students who are taking Ritalin. Because adolescent brains are still developing, the frontal lobes are not completely developed. Processes like myelination, synaptic pruning are still going on. So interfering with psychotropic drugs in the brain could have long-lasting harmful effects. So this is something that everyone should be careful about. Yeah, even provigil, so modafinil, if you constantly manipulate the brain in sleep-wake cycles, it could become maladaptive and could result in metabolic problems. This is just one article that's been pointing to that. You don't find a lot of people who defend enhancement talking about the risks. Again, it's important to point out that long-term risks are not known, but there are risks. I mean, exactly what they are, but there do seem to be risks. It depends. It's interesting. Online surveys indicate that the perceived likelihood and extent of side effects from cognition-enhancing drugs reduce the willingness among students and university teachers to use them. Older people tend to be more risk-averse. So this is underscores this point about adolescents taking these drugs. They're not risk-averse. Not saying they're risk-seekers, but they may not be thinking about these things. So why do we focus so much on these things? You know, a lot of people, myself included, drink coffee, caffeine. That's a stimulant. Why do we focus on that? It's the most widely used drug, stimulant. So do the first class of drugs have more direct and lasting effects on the brain? There are non-pharmacological forms of enhancement too. So this gets back to the question about fairness and equality that I raised earlier. People who are better off can afford trainers, tutors. That doesn't involve drugs. Why should we focus on drugs? So cognition-enhancing drugs are one component. They're just one factor in enhancement. They're not the only type of enhancement, enhancing people's capacity. So I could have a trainer or tutor that's going to enhance my cognitive functions. It's not direct in the same way as a drug, but it still has effects. So all of these things have to be considered together. So it's going to depend on how much of an advantage, just how much difference it makes. It's complex. I think it's more complex than the doping issue in sports because there are more factors, social factors involved. Who'll take the drugs? So the better off will take the drugs as well. So does that mean that any leveling of the playing field that may be temporary is just going to be offset again because people who are better off are going to take the drugs? So it's the stadium effect where the people in the front row stand up and then other people stand up. You have to keep standing up to stay above them. So social inequality. So what are the issues here? Drugs are just one component. And the drugs themselves are not everything, okay? It's persistence, willpower, motivation, patience, resilience. All of these factors are not affected by these cognition-enhancing drugs. So even if the drugs benefit people, that's just one component in the whole picture. That's a nice quote from Margaret Talbot. So there's more to enhancement than just taking the drug. Oh, sorry. Nicotine, yeah. I heard that one. So is it inauthentic? So are we cheating ourselves? Are we doing something that's not part of ourselves? This is a very difficult issue because some people would say, like Michael Sandel, The Case Against Perfection, that taking these drugs undermines the idea of excellence and achievement. And other people who are more proponents for enhancement would say that, no, it just enables us to fully exercise the natural capacities we have. So a lot of disagreement about that. And here we go with this therapy versus enhancement distinction. So I think we should think of it as along a spectrum. There are differences at the ends of the spectrum. In the broad middle range, I think that's where the disagreement is. Sorry, that's a very unscientific sort of sketch where, so it's, abnormal, exceptional. I mean, in that normal optimal range is where a lot of the questions arise. So there'll be some issues where it's really not clear whether it's therapy and enhancement. And frankly, I'm not sure that really matters. What matters is whether it's going to benefit the person. How do you weigh benefits against risk, benefit against harm? Okay, this is, I have to stop. This is an issue. So I mentioned the surgeon's coercion and unreasonable expectations. I have heard accounts of certain hospitals where, not here, but where there is pressure on surgeons to work longer hours and to perform more surgeries. And the question that comes up is, would they be forced to take a drug which would keep them awake longer so that they could do more surgeries? Okay? Would that be an unreasonable expectation? So it's something, or would airlines make pilots take these things, assuming they were safe, which is not really known. So more studies would have to be done. Suppose the studies showed that the drugs were safe and they had the positive effect. We can imagine that there may be cases of coercion like that. So how do you protect against that? Okay, so with that in mind, in 2008 there was a group of ethicists. There was Hank Greeley is a lawyer. There were some neuroscientists and bioethicists who came up with guidelines. And as far as I know, nothing really has been done. I don't know if they've approached government agencies or what's been done, because enhancement, as far as I know, is just still going on. So they came up with guidelines and laws needed to prevent coercion and forced use of cognition-enhancing drugs. Just very general guidelines. Do things to prevent coercion, protect, ensure that studies are done to determine benefits versus risks. Fairness, equality, these issues have to be considered, but there's very, very general guidelines, and it hasn't really been followed up. But this is definitely something that has to be done. So I'm going to stop there, and if you have questions, I'd be very happy to take them. Thank you.
it's not cost effective, but it might be humane and balanced.
I think many things should be done that way. Pilots, surgeons, but you hit the nail on the head, cost effective. So.
Can you repeat the question? Can you say what he said?
Okay, yeah, sorry. Is this on? Yeah, okay. Whether, instead of forcing, okay, and if I don't get this right, correct me, okay? Whether, instead of forcing airline pilots to work longer hours, taking the drug so that they could work longer hours, wouldn't it be better to reduce their time, their flight time, to make it safer, and which would probably mean hiring 2 pilots instead of 1 to do all the flights. So. Okay? Yes?
You mentioned about a quarter of students, high school students, were on Ritalin and other enhancing drugs. First of all, who is prescribing these? Are they family doctors? And these are students who do not have any
Right.
psychological disease or neurological disease. And if so, it seems like there needs to be more education of the family doctors or whatever doctor is prescribing them. And secondly, are these
Yeah.
drugs used illegal? I mean, are they sold illegal to high school students a lot?
Okay, good. Yeah, I didn't mention this. Good. A lot of students get them from other students or the internet. Yeah. So I mean, the drugs themselves, they're FDA approved. So they are legitimately prescribed for students who have certain disorders. So my sense is that the percentage of physicians who are prescribing these to adolescents is very, very low. I hope so. So they're getting, I don't know if illegal is the right. Anyway, they're getting the drugs through means that. To which people usually don't get them. So yeah, so other students or from the internet. Yeah, did you, someone else? Yes?
A lot of the teenagers that I've worked with consider marijuana a focusing drug. And they take it before they go to school in order to be able to work better. So is it psychostimulant?
Yeah.
Besides destroying the connections because they're breaking up.
Yeah. Is marijuana? It's not. Is it decriminalized in Texas? Or, okay, no. Okay. Actually, it's going to be. It's been legalized in Canada, which I think is a mistake because I don't think people have fully considered the risk. Well, I mean, but there are some medicinal uses, legitimate medicinal uses for it, but.
Is it actually a psychostimulant?
Yeah, it changes the brain. Yeah, I mean, anything that alters the brain, or it's a brain-altering drug, so that falls into the same category as the others. I mean, I'm not sure it would be called a stimulant, but people who use these can give all kinds of explanations or rationales for why they use them. And if something benefits them, if they report that it benefits them, is that enough? I mean, to justify its use? Because there are risks, especially in an adolescent brain, because the brain is still developing. And that's been finally, some physicians in Canada now are coming out and saying that if you do, I mean, it is going to be legalized, but they haven't actually fine-tuned it. So many people rightly, I think, are saying that adolescents should not be, it shouldn't be available to adolescents. So I think I think 19 is the age, which I don't think is high enough, but, so, yeah. What do you think about caffeine versus these other things? Is that, I mean, this is something that, see, I mean, well, me too, I don't think anything of it, yeah.
National Geographic had a wonderful article, I think it was June 2014 and 15,
Yeah.
on caffeine. And they had MRIs of a caffeine user
Mhm.
and a non-caffeine user before drinking that first cup of coffee for the,
Mhm.
for the caffeine user,
Yeah.
and after drinking for both the non-caffeine user and the caffeine user. And there are areas of the brain in a caffeine user that do not activate until the brain receives the caffeine.
Caffeine, yeah. Well, that gets into the issue of addiction too. Okay. So the brain could adjust itself because, like other addictions, so there are changes in the brain and it adjusts and doesn't normalize until you've got the substance in there. So, yeah. Yeah. Well, addiction is an important issue. Along with risk, I mean, well, that's one of the risks. I said a lot of people, at least in the bioethical debate on enhancement, haven't, not that they ignored risk, but they haven't considered risk as much as they should, and addiction is one of them. And I mentioned a slide, this Nora Volkov, she's a neuroscientist. She has done studies showing that there are definite risks to taking these drugs in the reward system, that it can lead to addictive behavior.
Walter, isn't there a tendency for the drug companies to try to pre-market these drugs? I mean, you see it on the TV ads already that they're suggesting enhancement, memory, etc. You've listed so many different drugs that an aggressive drug company could be flooding the market with these drugs, even if the studies haven't been.
Yeah. So yeah, I can imagine them. Yeah, slick marketing about how you'll be smarter and you'll do better and everything if you take this drug. This underscores the question of what the obligations of physicians are in prescribing. Especially when there are risks. So I don't have. I haven't come across data. I'm not sure studies, any really good studies, other than what I've heard anecdotally, have indicated just what the percentage is of physicians who prescribe these drugs for off-label, non-therapeutic uses. Now, so there, as I indicated on one of the slides, there's data on the number of people who take them for off-label purposes who don't have a disorder. What's not clear, what's not known is what the percentage is of physicians who are prescribing the drugs. That's not known. My sense is, I will say one thing. When I was, a few years ago, one of the neurology residents at the University of Calgary did a study of other neurology residents to get a sense of how many of them had used cognition-enhancing drugs. And he did the study and he published it, but he suspected, he told me that a lot of them were not being honest in their answers, the ones who did the survey. So that's another issue. I mean, that's the sort of thing that's very difficult to tease out, but it's still not known just how many. Now, these were residents who were taking drugs for their own enhancement, so it wasn't about them prescribing the drugs for patients, so that's not known. Yes? Yeah, I've heard of that, yeah. This is, getting back to Bill's point. Memory is dementia, the incidence of dementia increasing. Memory is something that everybody is concerned about. So drug companies can take advantage of that in their marketing strategies and say that this works really well. So, if you take this, your memory will improve and everything else. So that's, how do you regulate that? Interestingly, drug advertising is not allowed in Canada. Advertising is, yeah, well, that may change, but I don't know what it's like in other countries. I notice when I'm watching TV, I'll be watching the CBC or something, some local Vancouver network, and then I'll switch to ABC or NBC, the Seattle affiliate, and then I'll say, wow, one after another, drug company commercial, this. A lot of them are usually Viagra or something like that, but increasingly, important point about memory. Supposedly memory-enhancing drugs. So that's where there are a lot of people who would be susceptible to that type of marketing, and whether they work or not. That's something else. So that's another dimension of all of this. It's doing studies to indicate whether it's safe and effective. The other thing is something could be safe but not effective and just be a waste of time and money, and yet drug companies can get people to take these things and they have no benefit at all. Yes?
Could you address the use of propanol for like musicians who suffer from stage fright?
Yeah, okay. Good, yeah.
That, as a result, the side effect is that they might be fearless and walk out into traffic because, they're...
Yeah, okay, good, okay. So propranolol, right? Yeah, okay. Okay, good, yeah, okay. The question was, could I address the issue of musicians taking propranolol to deal with stage fright, right?
Yes.
Okay. And what are the risks there? Could they, because it does dampen this autonomic sort of fear response. Would they be at risk of just going out and not losing their normal fear response and going into traffic and being harmed? Okay, I mentioned the drug Inderol. Actually, propranolol is just the brand name or the trade name for the same drug. So I mentioned it in the case of the example of neurosurgeons to stay calm. Yeah, a lot of musicians, and I found this disturbing. Some of my graduate students take that drug, propranolol, before they do a presentation because their anxiety level is so high. So it reduces this fear response, this autonomic biological response, and it gets rid of all of these obstacles that would to enable someone to just do something fearlessly and automatically. But you're right, there are risks. What's not known is it would depend on the dose, about whether it would have that effect, whether it would dampen the natural fear response to such a degree that people would really be at risk of harming themselves. But one thing I do know, a musician who used to take propranolol, this is a violinist, told me that she did it for a while and it did seem to improve her performance. But she didn't feel, this goes to the issue of authenticity. She thought that she was cheating herself and she just wasn't being her true self, so she stopped taking it. She didn't like the idea of depending on that or feeling that she depended on it. She did say that when she was on it, the edge, the emotional rush of playing was gone. So it took, well, not completely, but it was dampened. So it took something away from the natural emotional experience of performing, doing a recital or performing a live concert. And that was one of the reasons why she said she stopped taking it. So there are risks, there are negative effects, some are worse than others, but this one, yeah, in particular, it would depend on the dose. The other thing I don't know, and I don't think studies have been done, is what the long-term risks of it would be. It's a beta blocker drug, right? Okay. I was prescribed that class of drugs years ago when I had a problem, and it didn't help me at all. So, but yeah, but there are risks. But it does, for a lot of people, it is effective. It is an indirect form of enhancement. It does help them to stay calm. But even the grad students who take it, they said after the fact they don't feel good about depending on that.
I'm sure that there are many more questions
Oh, yeah.
that can be raised. I think that at this point, we should thank Professor Glannon for filling us in on many of the questions, issues, and risks of